Hello friends, this is Reckless Tempest, Value Grinder Extraordinaire. Today I'm going to go over what are the top cards you need to get for your Negan the Cold-Blooded Commander deck. Before we begin, please click the subscribe button down below to get notified when I craft new VODs on MTG News, Finance, and Gameplay. So, Negan the Cold-Blooded is a 5 mana, 2 generic, 1 red, 1 white, 1 black, 4/3 human rogue. When he enters the battlefield, you and target opponent each secretly choose a creature that player controls. Then those choices are revealed, and that player sacrifices those creatures. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a creature, you create a treasure token. The reason I think Negan is really worth building around and exploring all the different cards available is because I think commanders that kill commanders are kind of good, even if it's only one commander. There's mind games available where you start picking, like you kind of start building patterns where it's like you keep picking the best creature, and then if your opponent starts automatically picking the best creature and you start picking, their second or third best, you can start getting 2-for-1s. And also there's some nice synergies we can touch on with, flickering, edicts, treasure tokens, all being kind of cool. Before we get into it, let me explain the goal of these suggestions. First off, I'm going to be focusing on the multiple synergies that are in Negan's wall of text. And secondly, most of these are just suggestions to get your brain juices churning. They aren't cards I'm saying you have to play. Let's start off with cards that either give us more treasure tokens or are enabled by them. First up, we have Dockside Extortionist. It's a 1/2 for 1 generic, 1 red, and when it comes into play, you get X treasures, where X is the number of artifacts and enchantments your opponents control. So, if you have 3 opponents, odds are, if you play this on your turn 3, if everyone took a turn 2, you'll probably get at least 1 to 2 treasures, assuming they're playing mana rocks on turn 2. But as the game goes on and people start getting more and more stuff in play, maybe they play a card that, is going to come up later in the list and they end up with a lot of artifacts. Like, this is just going to make you a ton of treasure tokens. Next up is Revel in Riches. 4 generic, 1 black enchantment. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you create a treasure token. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more treasures, you win the game. Obviously, this is a little bit of gives us treasure tokens, because, Negan's pretty good at killing opponent's creatures, and so is black. But also, it's a good payoff too, right? Winning the game. Normally that's why people play games of Magic, right? Next, we have the staple Smothering Tithe. 3 generic, 1 white. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2 generic. If they don't, you create a treasure token. This kind of gets pretty silly pretty quick, since 2 is significantly more than the heuristic steady tax. Captain Lannery Storm is a 2 generic, 1 red, 2/2 haste, and when it attacks, you get a treasure token. And whenever you sacrifice a treasure, Captain Lannery Storm gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So this is like a nice little rampy card to get you up to 5 mana for Negan, but also if you get a crap ton of treasure tokens in the mid game, spend them all, you can probably do a pretty chunk of damage with Captain Lannery Storm. So, and the card's pretty cheap money wise, so I like it in here. And last up for cards that give us treasure tokens on my suggestions is Brass's Bounty. 6 generic, 1 red. Sorcery, for each land you control, create a treasure token. This is just, big glut of mana you can get. Yeah, really there's not a whole lot more to say about this. Like, maybe you don't want this in every deck, but maybe it'll make the cut in your build. For cards that get paid off or enabled by treasure tokens, we have Arch of Oraska. It's a land, it has Ascend, which is if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. Tap, add a colorless. 5 generic tap, draw a card, but only if you have the City's Blessing. If you have 5 lands or 5 mana sources, you play Negan, you get 1 to 2 treasure tokens, you're not going to be far off from getting City's Blessing and being able to, turn your Arch of Oraska into a Jade-Aim Tome with a 25% higher activated mana cost. Next up is All That Glitters. 1 generic, 1 white, aura. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. So the more treasures we have, the bigger the plus gets. Maybe you could put this in like a Mimi deck with Negan if you give him evasion. Maybe you play Lucille. You know, if you get up to an obscene amount of tokens, kind of like what Revel in Riches wants, 10 treasure tokens, you might be getting at the range where all that glitters plus Negan might get close to killing someone with commander damage. Thirdly, treasure map, 2 mana artifact. One for 1 generic and tap, you scry 1 and put a landmark counter on treasure map. Then if there are 3 or more landmark counters on it, remove those counters, transform treasure map, and create 3 treasure tokens. And the flip side of treasure map is treasure cove. Tap, add a colorless, or tap, sacrifice a treasure, draw a card. This is just a nice way to smooth early draws and actually give you cards for all the treasures you're making as the game goes on. And lastly, we have another pricey card in Twilight Prophet. 2 generic, 2 black, flying, ascend. 10 permanents, you get City's Blessing. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have the City's Blessing, reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand. Each opponent loses X and you gain X life, where X is the card's converted mana cost. So, you know, just another card that gets pretty good when we put a lot of permanents into play. And I think Negan combined with a few edicts and stuff like that will be pretty good at getting a City's Blessing, you know, about turn 6, turn 7, somewhere around there, depending on how things go, how much we get interrupted. Next up, let's look at cards that'll help us trigger Negan's Enter the Battlefield trigger multiple times. First up, we have Ephemerate, 1 white mana instant, exile target creature control, then return it under your control, and has Rebound, which means if you cast it from your hand, exile it and cast it on your upkeep for free. This is just a very cost-efficient way to flicker our Negan if our opponent tries to kill it, or, you know, if we want to trigger Negan's ability. And the fact that we get a treasure token on the first resolution of the ability means this is almost a free roll. Next up, we have Ghostway and Eerie Interlude. They're both 2 generic, 1 white for an instant. Ghostway exiles all your creatures and returns them to the battlefield at the end step. And Eerie Interlude does the same, except you can pick which creatures are flickered. Panharmonicon is a 4 mana artifact that's the love child of Saffron Olive. If an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So, in English, Negan will trigger. If we play other creatures with enter the battlefield effects, this will also trigger them a second time. You know, and where it is on curve, we can play this on turn 4, Negan on turn 5, or a bit earlier if we play a Mana Rock. Conjurer's Closet is a 5 mana artifact. At the beginning of your end step, you may exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. A little bit of a budget option, but flickers Negan, gets another trigger, other stuff, etc. The next 2 cards we have up combo nicely with Kiki Jiki, Feldar Guardian and Restoration Angel. They're both 3 generic and 1 white. Guardian's a 1/4. When it comes into play, you just flicker another permanent you control. And Restoration Angel is a 3/4 flying flash creature. And when it comes into play, flicker target non-angel creature you control. Eldrazi Displacer is a 3 mana, 2 generic, 1 white, 3/3 that is colorless. And for 2 generic, 1 colorless, you can exile target creature, then return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's controller. Flicker Negan. If we have a lot of mana, we can do it multiple times. Also, you can use this defensively if your opponent's attacking you with, you know, a giant creature, or at the beginning of combat, you know, you just flicker it, comes into play tapped. So it's got some nice versatility there. And our last 3 cards are Kaya's Ghost Form, Supernatural Stamina, and Undying Evil. They're just 1 mana black cards that will bring Negan back to the battlefield if he dies. Kaya's Ghost Form is a 1 mana aura. You can also put it on a Planeswalker. Supernatural Stamina gives it +2/+0, and it returns it to the battlefield tapped. And Undying Evil just gives it Undying, so if Negan dies, he'll come into play and with a 1/1 counter on him. Now let's look at cards that cause our opponents to sacrifice a creature, or that trigger when they do. First up is Blood Artist. It's 1 generic, 1 black for a 0/1 vampire. Whenever Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Mayhem Devil is 1 generic, 1 black, 1 red for a 3/3 devil. Whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, Mayhem Devil deals 1 damage to any target. So both of these are pretty good at, you know, rapid firing off when we start getting Negan triggers on, and when we start playing other cards on this list. The next two cards are Grave Pact and Dictate of Erebos. Grave Pact is 3 black and 1 generic for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control dies, each other player sacrifices a creature. If we play a lot of creatures with enter the battlefield effects, as I brought up earlier with Panharmonicon, this is kind of a good way to start like making a value chain of like creatures we just sacrifice to make our opponent sacrifice stuff, then we start getting treasures, and just kind of goes from there. And Dictate of Erebos is 3 generic, 2 black. It's Grave Pact, but it has flash, so that's pretty sweet too. Then we have Plaguecrafter and Demon's Disciple. Both of them are 2 generic, 1 black, for one's a human shaman, one's a human cleric. When they enter the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and with Plaguecrafter, each player who can't discards a card, whereas Demon's Disciple doesn't have that clause. Disciple's a 3-1, Plaguecrafter's a 3-2. I like both of these just because they can hit planeswalkers, and there are some versions of these cards from older sets that don't hit planeswalkers with the effects, which I think suck, because planeswalkers are really good, who'd have thought, and you should have a lot of ways to get rid of them. Soul Shatter is 2 generic, 1 black for an instant. Each opponent sacrifices a creature planeswalker with the highest converted mana cost among creatures and planeswalkers they control. Nice little efficient way to blow up creatures and walkers. Vona's Hunger is 2 generic, 1 black for an instant. It has Ascend, so if we have 10 permanents, we get City's Blessing. Each opponent sacrifices a creature. If you have City's Blessing, instead each opponent sacrifices half the creatures they control rounded up. So this is another card that gets juiced up with all the treasure synergies we brought up earlier in the VOD. Crackling Doom is 1 red, 1 black, and 1 white for an instant. Does 2 damage to each opponent, and each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures that player controls. I think this is like super good, because unlike most edicts where you're normally killing the weakest creature your opponent has, because why would they sacrifice the best? This usually will hit the best creature they have available. Our next 2 cards are Mythos of Snapdax and Tragic Arrogance. They're both kind of similar. Mythos of Snapdax is 2 generic, 2 white for a sorcery. Each player chooses an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a planeswalker from among the non-land permanents they control, then sacrifice the rest, so Sophie's Choice. If you put red or blue into the generic, you instead choose the permanents for each player, so you're going to be making them keep the worst permanents of each type they have available, and get rid of the rest. And Tragic Arrogance is just 3 generic, 2 white. For each player you choose among the permanents, that player controls an artifact, a creature, enchantment, and a walker. Then each player sacrifices all other non-land permanents they control. So this is just a more expensive Mythos of Snapdax in a Mardu deck. The Eldest Reborn is 4 generic, 1 black for a Saga enchantment. And as the Saga enters the battlefield and after your draw step, add a lore counter. After the 3rd counter is put on it, sacrifice it. The first counter, each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. At 2, each opponent discards a card. And at 3, put target creature or planeswalker card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So, like the previous 3 cards, right, this'll make people sacrifice creatures or planeswalkers, but it's also got a nice backdoor reanimator effect, so I'm a big fan of this card, even though it's a little on the pricey side. And lastly, we have Liliana Dreadhorde General. Whenever a creature you control dies, draw a card. +2, create a 2/2 black zombie. -4, each player sacrifices 2 creatures. And -9, each opponent chooses a permanent they control of each permanent type and sacrifices the rest. So very similar to Mythos and Tragic Arrogance. And she's 4 generic and 2 black, with 6 loyalty. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown. If you want more of it, please click the subscribe button down below, and that like button helps me out and lets me know you enjoy this. If you have any questions or if I missed something, please let me know in the comments. And lastly, check out my eBay store for sweet MTG cards, or my Twitch stream where I stream Pauper every once in a while. Links are in the description below. See you next time.